Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. That way, when the silence starts to deepen, when the signs begin to appear, you'll remember exactly when it began. There exists a symbol, unnamed and yet unmistakable, which has haunted the margins of literature for over a century. Neither explicitly defined nor ever fully described, it is a cipher that reappears when reason begins to slip, when the veil between fiction and truth wears thin. It is called the yellow sign, and those who encounter it, whether within the pages of a forgotten book, glimpsed in a crumbling manuscript, or muttered in hushed tones among the culturally initiated, are said to be unable to forget what they have seen. More troubling still, they are often no longer able to function within the world as they once did. This project is not an act of decoding, but of intellectual pursuit. And yet, the deeper we trace its lineage, the more we must admit that understanding may be the very thing it punishes. The yellow sign first emerged in Robert W. Chambers' 1895 collection, The King in Yellow, an enigmatic suite of stories that occupies a strange threshold between Gothic decadence, symbolist anxiety, and proto-cosmic horror. But it did not remain there. It leaked outward into Lovecraft's mythos, into 20th century paranoia, into digital age folk horror. Our approach here will be layered and methodical: historical origins, philosophical implications, literary manifestations, and cultural aftermath. Before the yellow sign became a symbol of contagion, it existed as a byproduct of fin de siècle disillusionment, a time when beauty itself had begun to rot. Robert W. Chambers, born in 1865 in Brooklyn, entered the literary landscape not as a mystic, but as an artist trained in the precise realism of the Académie Julian in Paris. His early career as an illustrator for Life and Vogue demonstrated a fascination with the visible world. Yet beneath that technical precision lay a creeping fascination with what could not be drawn. The 1890s, with their oscillation between progress and decline, between positivism and decay, provided fertile ground for such ambivalence. It was a decade haunted by aesthetic exhaustion, by the twilight of Victorian confidence, and by the rise of symbolism, a movement that believed reality concealed rather than revealed truth. In this milieu, Chambers composed The King in Yellow, 1895, a book that masqueraded as fiction but behaved like revelation. It is not a novel nor a mere collection of stories, but a fractured mirror of modernity's sickness, each tale a reflection of beauty's disintegration beneath the pressure of too much meaning. It is said that Chambers was influenced by the French decadence, by Huysmans à Rebours, 1884, by the symbolist theater of Maeterlinck, by the ornate morbidity of Wilde's Salome. These works elevated artifice to the level of theology and turned aesthetic experience into sacrament. Yet Chambers' innovation lay in transforming aesthetic excess into existential threat. Where Wilde sought beauty in corruption, Chambers saw revelation in collapse. His protagonists are not artists who create, but artists who unravel. Their sensitivity becomes their curse. The fictional play The King in Yellow, the unholy text said to induce madness, thus functions as a metonym for late 19th century anxiety. That knowledge and art, once heralded as humanity's salvation, had become the very tools of its undoing. This reveals something profound about the era's intellectual mood. Beauty was no longer redemptive, but terminal. The world into which The King in Yellow appeared was itself teetering on epistemological crisis. Scientific rationalism had promised to banish superstition, yet Darwinian theory had displaced humankind from the center of creation, and Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, 1882, had dismantled the metaphysical scaffolding of meaning. Chambers, writing in the shadow of these revelations, constructed narratives in which reality itself is porous, where perception cannot be trusted and identity dissolves under the weight of hidden truths. Consider this carefully. Chambers' work arrives just before Freud's interpretation of dreams, 1900, and Jung's early writings on archetypes, as if anticipating the 20th century's psychological descent. The madness that follows the reading of the forbidden play is not merely supernatural, it is epistemic, a dramatization of what happens when human consciousness glimpses the abyss where meaning once resided. We must pause here to note that Chambers' method was deceptively subtle. Unlike later cosmic horror, which often gestures toward monstrous entities, his terror is rooted in suggestion, omission, and the disquieting normalcy of the unreal. The first act of the play is said to be harmless, the second, unbearable. This structure mirrors the human condition itself: curiosity as gateway, revelation as ruin. The pattern is recursive and triadic: temptation, exposure, collapse. It is not merely a device of fiction, but an allegory of intellectual progress. In the modern age, every discovery seems to promise clarity, yet delivers fragmentation. Chambers captured this paradox before it became the defining rhythm of modern consciousness. It is not accidental that the yellow sign appears as a product of literary contagion. The 1890s were obsessed with diseases of both body and mind: syphilis, hysteria, neurasthenia, each seen as manifestations of overstimulation. Chambers transposed these cultural neuroses into symbolic form. The act of reading the play mirrors infection. Aesthetic experience becomes pathology. In The Yellow Sign, the symbol operates like a virus that crosses boundaries between art, flesh, and dream. Here, knowledge behaves as plague, and perception itself becomes fatal. This alignment between contagion and cognition was emblematic of a world terrified by its own expanding consciousness. We might even say the yellow sign was never meant as an object at all. It is an idea with incubation period. Chambers' contemporaries received the king in yellow with ambivalence, sensing that it spoke a language they recognized but could not translate. Reviewers in the Bookman and Harper's Weekly called it unwholesome, curiously haunting, and impossible to forget. Such reaction suggests not misunderstanding, but recognition, a collective shudder from readers who felt themselves implicated. It was not a story they consumed, but a pattern they entered. Like the decadent literature of the time, it blurred consumption and corruption. To read was to participate. The book's fragmented structure, alternating between cosmic despair and genteel romance, only deepened this sense of contamination. The mundane stories that follow the first half serve as a kind of recovery period, a denial that the infection ever occurred. Yet, as any careful reader notices, the contagion lingers in syntax, tone, and atmosphere. The irony of Chambers' success is that he soon abandoned horror altogether. After 1895, he turned to romantic fiction and historical adventure, producing over 60 novels largely forgotten today. Scholars have long debated this shift. Was it disillusionment, commercial necessity, or the psychological recoil of one who had seen too much? It is tempting to view this retreat as a narrative mirror of his own creation. Like his characters, Chambers glimpsed something unbearable in the act of creation itself. Not unlike Lovecraft later, he intuited that horror is not a genre, but a condition of knowledge. Once articulated, it transforms both the speaker and the world they inhabit. To continue would be to risk dissolution. In tracing this origin, we see that the yellow sign was never meant to be merely symbolic. It was historical, born from the collision of artistic idealism and philosophical despair. It stands at the intersection of fin de siècle decadence, scientific disillusionment, and aesthetic fatalism. Its emergence signals not the birth of a monster, but the death of certainty. Chambers' intent, conscious or otherwise, was to expose art's complicity in madness, to reveal that the pursuit of truth through beauty leads not to transcendence, but to corruption. It is not simply horror dressed in aesthetic language, it is aestheticism exposed as horror. Thus, we arrive at a paradox that will shape every subsequent appearance of the yellow sign. Its creator did not believe he was inventing myth, yet he became its first victim. From the decaying Parisian ateliers to the haunted salons of New York, Chambers transmitted an idea that would outlive him. As the century unfolded, others would take up his lexicon: Bierce, Lovecraft, Derleth, each transforming it into their own epistemic poison. But before we follow the sign's diffusion, we must first uncover its deeper roots in the intellectual traditions and symbolic languages that predated Chambers himself. The contagion began long before he named it, and to understand it, we must turn to its cultural and philosophical antecedents. To understand the yellow sign, not merely as an invention of Robert W. Chambers, but as the culmination of much older, darker impulses, we must examine the cultural and philosophical strata that prefigure its creation. The late 19th century did not birth the concept of forbidden knowledge, it merely refined it. The yellow sign, with its devastating psychological effects and resistance to clear meaning, emerges at the confluence of multiple intellectual traditions. The Gothic fascination with unreadable texts, the symbolist belief in hidden realities, and the existential dread ushered in by modern philosophy. Each of these threads lends the yellow sign its potency. Together, they render it not just a symbol, but a symptom of something older than literature and more corrosive than madness. First, we must consider the long-standing motif of the accursed text, which runs like a vein of mercury through Western literature. From the apocryphal Book of Enoch to the Faustian grimoires of the Renaissance, stories of forbidden books have served as mirrors for cultural anxiety. In these narratives, the written word is not a vehicle for enlightenment, but a trapdoor to epistemic collapse. Consider Goethe's Faust, 1808, where the pursuit of knowledge results in spiritual damnation. Or, even earlier, the myth of Prometheus, whose theft of divine fire parallels the dangerous illumination offered by such texts. The yellow sign participates in this tradition, but adds a modern twist. Unlike the Necronomicon of Lovecraft, which came after it, the play within the King in Yellow cannot even be summarized without inviting disaster. It is not just the content of the book that is dangerous, but its very form, a concept echoing fin de siècle fears that aesthetic experience itself could induce madness. This brings us to symbolism, the aesthetic and philosophical movement that crystallized in France during the 1880s and whose influence on Chambers, who studied art in Paris, is well documented. Symbolism rejected materialism and sought to portray the invisible world behind physical appearances. According to Stéphane Mallarmé, whose writings bordered on the indecipherable, to name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment of a poem. The goal, then, was not to clarify but to disturb, not to express but to summon. Chambers' yellow sign functions in precisely this way. It is not a coherent message, but a rupture in the semiotic fabric of reality. The more one attempts to understand it, the more unstable meaning becomes. Like the symbols in Mallarmé's poetry, or the mysteries of Odilon Redon's charcoal drawings, it opens a space that cannot be closed, a silence that cannot be unheard. This is no accident. Chambers was absorbing a world in which language was failing, and he encoded that failure into his fiction. Philosophically, the sign also draws from the pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer and the nihilism of Friedrich Nietzsche. Schopenhauer's notion of the will, a blind, irrational force underlying all existence, casts human life as inherently tragic. For him, art offered a temporary escape, but never salvation. Nietzsche, writing in The Gay Science, 1882, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883-85, declared the death of God and the attendant collapse of objective truth. In such a universe, symbols lose their moorings. They drift, they deceive. The yellow sign reflects this condition perfectly. It is not a mark of power, but a remainder, the fragment of a worldview that once claimed coherence but now exists only as ruin. We must recognize, then, that Chambers' horror is not theological, but philosophical. The terror it invokes is not of hell, but of the void that remains once heaven has been dismantled. At the same time, the yellow sign may be read through the Gnostic tradition, which predates Christianity and posits a hidden, false reality maintained by malevolent spiritual entities. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world is a deception, a prison created by the demiurge to trap divine sparks. Liberation comes not through faith, but through gnosis, a secret knowledge often depicted as dangerous, forbidden, or fatal. Here, the yellow sign becomes something more than a fictional device. It is a modern instantiation of this ancient pattern. It reveals not the truth of the world, but the truth that the world itself is a lie. The madness that follows is not irrationality, but clarity. This inversion, where insanity becomes insight, is at the heart of the yellow sign's enduring power. It is not simply a symbol of fear, but a revelation too devastating to integrate. Consider carefully. In all these traditions, the moment of recognition is also the moment of collapse. To read the play, to see the sign, to understand the hidden structure behind reality, each is a transgression that cannot be undone. The yellow sign echoes the sacred tetragrammaton of Jewish mysticism, which, when spoken aloud, could obliterate the speaker. It reflects the Tibetan concept of terma, hidden teachings meant to be revealed only at specific times, often with disruptive effects. Even in Eastern traditions, knowledge is treated as both a blessing and a curse. Enlightenment can illuminate or annihilate, depending on the recipient's readiness. Chambers' creation, then, is not uniquely Western, but archetypal. It participates in a global pattern of belief that warns. Some truths are not merely hidden. They are protected from revelation by the consequences of being known. This helps explain why the yellow sign has no definitive shape, no consistent description, no agreed-upon interpretation. Its meaning shifts depending on context, reader, and moment of perception. That is not a flaw, it is the design. Like the alchemical Ouroboros, it consumes and recreates itself through repetition. The more one tries to define it, the more slippery it becomes. And yet, it reappears across time, in Chambers' stories, in Lovecraft's later mythos, in games, in conspiracy forums, in whispered warnings online. The sign is not a stable icon, but a recursive echo, a symbol that signifies its own instability. It is not simply a horror motif, but a philosophical machine designed to collapse the act of interpretation itself. In this way, we can begin to see the yellow sign as the cultural descendant of several overlapping traditions: Gothic literary terror, symbolist aesthetics, philosophical pessimism, and esoteric gnosis. It is a palimpsest of intellectual despair, layered, illegible, and self-defeating. By invoking these traditions, Chambers did not create a new mythology so much as reactivate an ancient one, cloaking it in the language of modernity. He gave shape, however fleeting, to the creeping suspicion that knowledge itself may be the root of suffering. In the next section, we will examine how even the language used to describe the sign participates in its destabilizing effect, tracing the etymology, symbolism, and semiotic breakdown that defines its presence in the text and beyond. In confronting the yellow sign, one quickly realizes that its horror does not arise from gore, monstrosity, or spectacle, but from something far more insidious. It is a symbol that refuses to signify. That is to say, the yellow sign deliberately short-circuits the process of meaning-making. To understand this, we must explore the etymology of yellow, the semiotic instability of the sign, and the symbolic systems it dismantles. In this section, we trace how the yellow sign functions not merely as a fictional object, but as a linguistic and philosophical rupture, an act of symbolic sabotage that leaves only disorientation in its wake. It is not simply a glyph within a story. It is a virus embedded in language itself. Let us begin with the word yellow, a color historically burdened with contradiction. In Western tradition, yellow oscillates between light and decay, enlightenment and betrayal. In Christian iconography, Judas Iscariot is often garbed in yellow robes, visually separating him from the apostles and marking him as the bringer of ruin. During the Inquisition, heretics were made to wear yellow as a public display of their treachery against divine order. In medieval plague iconography, yellow symbolized disease and rot. The jaundiced body, the spoiled field, the air turned noxious. Even in more recent centuries, the term yellow journalism evokes the corrupting influence of misinformation. Thus, Chambers' choice was not arbitrary. It is not merely that yellow looks sickly, but that it signals corruption masked as clarity. It is not the darkness of ignorance, but the overexposure of knowing too much, of staring too long into a light that blinds rather than illuminates. Now consider the second term, sign. In semiotic theory, particularly as developed by Ferdinand de Saussure in the early 20th century, a sign consists of the signifier, the form, and the signified, the concept. The power of the yellow sign lies in its refusal to stabilize either element. It is never clearly described in Chambers' text. Some interpretations suggest an angular, almost alchemical design. Others imagine something insectile, organic, or chaotic. This absence of visual clarity is intentional. It resists fixation. The sign is less a visual image and more a conceptual effect. Readers and characters who see it are not granted understanding, but are destabilized, unmoored from cognitive frameworks. We must pause here to recognize that this makes the yellow sign not a symbol of something, but a symbol against the very act of symbolizing. This disruption of meaning places the yellow sign in dialogue with later post-structuralist thinkers, particularly Jacques Derrida, who argued that signs always defer meaning in an endless chain of references, a process he called difference. The yellow sign performs this deferral with cruel efficiency. It initiates a semiotic collapse in which reference dissolve and interpretation becomes complicit in madness. Every attempt to define it leads the subject further from stability, further from sanity. Consider carefully. This is why so many fictional accounts describe the sign's effects in emotional or psychic terms: a sense of dread, a nameless fear, a feeling of being watched. The sign does not communicate, it infects. It is not a transmission of knowledge, but a mutation of perception. The use of yellow as the color of the sign is thus not decorative. It is semiotically purposeful. Yellow becomes the hue of dissonance, of signs gone wrong. When combined with the indefinite nature of the symbol itself, it invokes what scholars like Julia Kristeva describe as the abject, that which cannot be assimilated into the symbolic order. The abject is not simply disgusting, it is that which destabilizes identity, system, and boundary. The yellow sign is abject not because of what it represents, but because it resists representation. It is a placeholder for the unspeakable, and in encountering it, language ceases to function as a container of meaning. The result is epistemic vertigo, an inability to locate the self in a world suddenly stripped of its linguistic scaffolding. Here we may compare the yellow sign to other destabilizing linguistic artifacts. In ancient Jewish tradition, the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, was not to be spoken aloud, lest it disrupt the divine human boundary. In alchemical texts, certain symbols were deliberately obscured or coded to protect the uninitiated. In modern literature, one finds analogous phenomena in the inkblot language of William S. Burroughs or the apocalyptic glossolalia of Thomas Ligotti. Each presents symbols that tempt decoding while simultaneously resisting it. The yellow sign belongs to this lineage. It is not simply a fiction, it is an invocation, a glyph that performs symbolic collapse through exposure. It reveals the limit of signification itself. What makes this especially chilling is that the yellow sign is recognizable even when undefined. This paradox of a sign that is known yet unknowable mirrors the function of traumatic memory. Trauma, according to psychoanalytic theorists like Kathy Carruth, is not remembered but re-experienced in fragments, in flashbacks, in forms that evade narration. The yellow sign behaves similarly. It is not remembered by characters, it repeats itself through visions, sensations, and irreversible changes in cognition. Its semiotic function is not to clarify, but to trigger. It is not a passive object, it is a performative mechanism. To see it is to undergo it. We must therefore recognize that the yellow sign operates as a linguistic black hole. It draws meaning toward itself, but allows nothing coherent to escape. It is a semiotic singularity, an event horizon beyond which language fails. And yet, it remains compelling. Viewers cannot look away. Readers cannot unread. In this way, the yellow sign reflects the condition of modernity itself, a world flooded with signs, yet hollowed of stable meaning. It is not just a product of literature, it is a mirror to our linguistic crisis. In an era increasingly defined by misinformation, simulation, and semantic exhaustion, the yellow sign feels less like an archaic horror and more like a prophetic warning. As we move forward, this breakdown of language begins to reveal something even more disquieting. The yellow sign does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a larger system of symbolic contagion that includes the fictional play, the King in Yellow, and the mythic geography of Carcosa, Hastur, and Lake Holly. These elements collectively form a mythos that behaves not like traditional mythology, with gods and morals, but like an invasive idea system. In our next section, we will examine how Chambers constructed this mythology with eerie authenticity, using fragmented narrative and false documents to lend his creation the weight of ancient truth. The question is not merely what the yellow sign means, but whether meaning itself can survive its presence. When Robert W. Chambers introduced the King in Yellow in 1895, he did not merely invent a symbol. He constructed a world that felt older than its author, older even than the literature into which it emerged. This was not the traditional world building of fantasy fiction, with detailed maps and elaborate genealogies. Instead, Chambers employed a subtler, more insidious technique: mythopoeic suggestion. His stories, fragmented and oblique, create the illusion of uncovering fragments of a deeper, forgotten tradition. The result is a mythology that, while fictive, exerts the gravitational pull of ancient truth. The yellow sign, in this context, is not a standalone object. It is the visible ripple of a vast and unseen structure, a myth too large to be told outright. At the center of this mythology lies the fictional play, The King in Yellow, a text within the text that exerts a malevolent influence on those who read it. But unlike the cursed tomes of earlier Gothic fiction, Chambers never presents the play in full. Only scattered quotations, aphoristic, ominous, and dreamlike, are ever revealed. We read of "Strange is the night where black stars rise," and Casilda's song, but never the larger context. This absence is crucial. The partial quotations serve as pseudo-fragments, echoing the structure of real-world lost texts, such as Heraclitus's aphorisms or the Dead Sea Scrolls. They imply a complete and devastating whole, but one forever inaccessible. The reader becomes complicit in the act of imaginative reconstruction, assembling myth from shards. It is not simply that the play is forbidden, it is that it refuses to be complete, and in so doing mimics the elusive structure of esoteric truth. Consider this carefully. Chambers' method mirrors the Gnostic concept of revelation through anamnesis, not through new information, but through the unsettling recollection of something always known, but suppressed. The fictional universe of the Yellow King is presented not as discovery, but as reawakening. When characters read the play, when they see the yellow sign, they do not learn something new. They remember. This retroactive revelation functions mythologically. It positions the text not as the origin of horror, but as its symptom. Carcosa, Hastur, and the king do not invade reality. They emerge from its deepest cracks. The authenticity of this myth is not established through explanation, but through implication. There are no exposition dumps, no cosmologies laid out. Instead, there is the weight of the already existing, the uncanny feeling that this fiction is only revealing what has always been true. This effect is enhanced by Chambers' narrative technique. He embeds his horror not in overtly supernatural tales, but in otherwise realistic settings populated by artists, scientists, and professionals, rational individuals whose encounter with the myth leaves them shattered. The juxtaposition between mundane detail and mythic intrusion destabilizes genre expectations and lends the material a documentary quality. The horror is not confined to alien realms. It occurs in studios, bedrooms, and street corners. In this way, Chambers adopts a strategy later employed by H.P. Lovecraft, embedding invented mythologies within seemingly factual frameworks. This blending of realism and fiction is what literary theorist Tsvetan Todorov might call the fantastic, a moment of hesitation in which neither the supernatural nor the psychological can fully explain the event. The reader, like the character, is suspended between belief and disbelief. The structure of the King in Yellow collection also contributes to its mythic realism. The first 5 stories are directly connected to the yellow sign and the play. The remaining stories shift into romantic and historical fiction, with little overt connection to the mythos. This narrative discontinuity serves an important psychological function. It mimics the behavior of traumatic memory. Just as trauma is bracketed, suppressed, and avoided in everyday life, so too is the horror of the yellow sign bracketed within the text. The sudden departure from cosmic dread into conventional love stories doesn't soothe the reader. It deepens the uncanny, as if the horror still lingers in the margins, threatening to erupt again. It suggests a world where myth bleeds into reality, then vanishes, leaving only the reader's unease as proof it was ever there. We must recognize, too, that Chambers draws upon and subtly reconfigures real names and places to lend authenticity to his invented myth. Hastur and Carcosa were not his creations. They first appeared in the stories of Ambrose Bierce, particularly Haida the Shepherd, 1891, and An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886. Chambers appropriates these terms but reassigns them symbolic weight. Where Bierce's Carcosa was an allegorical ruin, Chambers' Carcosa is an interdimensional echo, a place not destroyed, but remembered incorrectly. This act of literary borrowing, using real texts to build fictional myth, creates an intertextual scaffolding that deceives the reader into mistaking invention for inheritance. It is not simply a fictional world. It is a palimpsest of fictions built atop half-remembered truths. Moreover, Chambers uses names that sound like corrupted echoes of real-world theologies and mythologies. The King in Yellow evokes the Fisher King of Arthurian legend, the exiled king motif found in Sumerian mythology, and the masked gods of tribal rites. His mask, not worn to conceal but to reveal, recalls the Eleusinian mysteries, wherein initiates were shown sacred objects that could not be spoken of afterward. The sign itself becomes a stand-in for the ineffable, a visual form that transmits nonverbal horror. All of these references function as mythic scaffolding. They signal to the reader that this horror is not new, but primordial, merely wearing the costume of late Victorian literature. The result is a mythology that resists closure. Unlike Tolkien's carefully mapped Middle-earth or Campbell's monomythic structure, Chambers' mythos is fragmented, recursive, and unresolved. It is not a story to be told, but a virus to be caught. The reader is not invited to understand, but to experience. And this experiential aspect, this performative dimension, makes the yellow sign not merely a symbol in a book, but a functioning piece of mythology. It behaves mythically. It appears across time, recurs in other works, and generates belief not through exposition, but through repetition. This reveals something unsettling. In the right narrative context, even a fiction can generate faith. As we move into the next part of our inquiry, we must carry this recognition forward. Chambers' mythology, though fragmentary and fictional, behaves like a system of belief. It is not something one reads, but something one falls into, much like the characters who see the sign and are never the same. This makes it especially important to examine the thematic core of the mythos, the philosophical structures, symbolic forces, and recurring motifs that define its internal logic. What is the nature of the cosmos implied by the yellow sign? What truths, if any, can be gleaned from its effects on the human mind? In Part 2, we will begin this investigation, starting with the concepts of insignificance, entropy, and dream reality that anchor the sign's enduring terror. To enter the world of the King in Yellow is to step into a philosophical terrain where meaning itself has eroded under cosmic pressure. Chambers' work predates Lovecraft by decades, yet it already articulates the fundamental concepts that would later define cosmic horror: insignificance, entropy, and the unreliability of perceived reality. Each of these ideas is not simply thematic ornamentation, but a philosophical assault on the humanist belief in coherence, progress, and purpose. The yellow sign stands at the center of this assault, functioning as both symbol and symptom of a world that no longer requires human meaning to exist. It is not a sign of revelation, but of exhaustion, a mark of systems that have decayed past comprehension. Human insignificance is perhaps the most visible philosophical pillar underpinning Chambers' mythos. In The Repairer of Reputations, the delusional, or possibly prophetic narrator, Hildred Castaigne, proclaims that the empire of the future belongs to the King in Yellow. Whether this is madness or vision, the implication is chilling. Human civilization is not the apex of existence, but a fragile structure already collapsing under cosmic inheritance. The idea echoes the late 19th century crisis of anthropocentrism, intensified by Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, and Nietzsche's declaration that humanity must transcend its illusions or perish under their weight. Chambers understood instinctively what these philosophers only gestured toward, that human consciousness, rather than revealing order, may only ever perceive fragments of a vaster chaos. It is not merely that humanity is small, but that its frameworks of understanding are misaligned with the nature of the universe itself. The yellow sign, therefore, becomes a cruel mirror reflecting this disproportion. We must pause here to consider that Chambers' depiction of insignificance differs subtly from Lovecraft's later nihilism. Lovecraft's cosmos is explicitly indifferent, populated by entities so vast that human minds crumble in their presence. Chambers, however, operates within a symbolist register. Insignificance is psychological, not merely cosmic. His characters are not crushed by external forces, but imploded by internal revelation. When Mr. Scott, in The Yellow Sign, dreams of a decaying church and an unblinking watchman, his terror is not of death, but of recognition, of realizing that his own consciousness is complicit in constructing the nightmare. It is not that the world is meaningless, it is that meaning itself is contagious. In this way, Chambers anticipated what existential philosophers like Sartre and Camus would later articulate, that the horror of existence is not found in the void, but in the realization that the void stares back through us. Entropy, the second philosophical core, serves as the metaphysical engine driving Chambers' world. In physics, entropy denotes the irreversible tendency toward disorder, but in Chambers' fiction, it becomes a moral and aesthetic principle. Everything decays, minds, societies, even symbols. The act of reading the forbidden play does not introduce chaos. It reveals it as the underlying order of all things. The sign's effect is therefore entropic, not because it destroys, but because it unmasks the illusion of structure. This aligns closely with the late Victorian fascination with degeneration, a concept popularized by Max Nordau's Degeneration, 1892, which interpreted modern art and literature as symptoms of cultural decay. Chambers internalized this cultural anxiety, but inverted it. Degeneration, in his view, is not decline from a former purity, but the natural endpoint of awareness. Once beauty and reason are fully apprehended, they cannot sustain themselves. They collapse beneath their own weight. Thus, entropy in Chambers' universe is less a process than a revelation, the recognition that decay is the true equilibrium of existence. The dream, in Chambers' cosmology, is the medium through which this entropy is experienced. Dreams dissolve the boundaries between perception and invention, between the internal psyche and external reality. In The Yellow Sign, dreams do not merely foreshadow events, they cause them. Scott's vision of the Watchman precedes the man's intrusion into his waking life, suggesting that dream and reality are not separate planes but mutually contaminating states. This conceptual fluidity anticipates Freud's interpretation of dreams, 1900, but goes further, proposing that consciousness itself is dreamlike. The waking world is not stable but interpretive, a projection endlessly rewriting itself. Consider carefully. In Chambers' universe, dream and reality are not opposites but phases of the same unstable matter. When the sign appears, it functions as the collapse point between these phases, a semiotic singularity that erases distinctions between observer and observed, waking and sleeping, real and unreal. It is not simply that Chambers wrote dreamlike stories. It is that he conceived reality as literature, an unstable narrative whose authorship has long been lost. The fictional play within the book acts as a mirror text, a reflection of the world it inhabits. Just as characters read the play and go mad, we too read The King in Yellow and experience a lesser version of the same contagion. The text performs what it describes. This recursive relationship recalls Jorge Luis Borges' later idea that the universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite number of hexagonal galleries. In Chambers' case, the galleries are not libraries but minds, each infected with fragments of a story they can neither finish nor forget. The dream, then, becomes the ultimate metaphor for human consciousness, a theater of symbols that believes itself real, even as it dissolves. These intertwined concepts, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, form a triadic system of horror. Each reinforces the others in a recursive loop. Insignificance ensures that human reason is inadequate to comprehend the whole. Entropy ensures that all attempts at comprehension disintegrate. And dream reality ensures that this disintegration can never be neatly separated from experience. The result is a worldview where horror is not an intrusion into life, but its natural state. The yellow sign, appearing at the intersection of these forces, becomes a metonym for existence itself, fragile, self-consuming, and self-aware. It is not an alien object that corrupts the mind. It is the mind realizing its own alienation. We must recognize finally that Chambers' philosophical project, if we may call it that, was prophetic. His fusion of aesthetic fatalism, psychological disintegration, and cosmic dread prefigured the modernist crisis that would dominate the early 20th century. Where T.S. Eliot saw a heap of broken images, Chambers saw those images rearranging themselves into a pattern beyond human recognition. His vision anticipates not only Lovecraft, but also Kafka, Borges, and even the existential absurdism of Camus. It is not the universe that mocks us, but our own insistence on coherence in the face of its dissolution. The yellow sign, in its blasphemous simplicity, embodies this insight. It is not a secret to be deciphered, but a truth to be endured. As we move into the next section, the question deepens. If insignificance, entropy, and dream reality form the philosophical groundwork of this world, what forces inhabit it? Who or what is the King in Yellow? What are the beings and principles that animate this mythic cosmology? To answer, we must descend further into the beings, entities, and abstract forces that define the metaphysical landscape of Chambers' universe, where consciousness meets its ancient reflection and names it divine. The yellow sign does not emerge in isolation. It belongs to a mythic architecture of interwoven names, locations, and all entities that form the deeper substratum of Chambers' world. Though Chambers provides few details, the repeated references to Carcosa, Hastur, Lake Hali, and the King in Yellow suggest a pantheon of forces, some sentient, some spatial, all destabilizing. These are not gods in any classical sense, nor demons in the theological sense. Rather, they are conceptual presences, embodiments of decay, unreality, and recursive perception. In this subsection, we investigate the key entities or forces implied by the mythos, focusing especially on the ambiguous identity of the King in Yellow, the mythic geography of Carcosa, and the symbolic resonance of names like Hastur and Hali. What emerges is not a taxonomy of monsters, but a metaphysical ecology, one that operates not through physical domination, but through ontological contagion. The King in Yellow is at once the most visible and the most unknowable entity in Chambers' mythos. He is described only in suggestion, a pallid mask, a tattered mantle, and a title that implies rule but never clarifies over what. In The Yellow Sign, the king is never directly seen, but implied through the influence of the eponymous symbol and the deterioration of the protagonist's reality. The opening epigraph from the fictional play reads, "Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Carcosa." This passage is often cited as the only explicit appearance of the king, and yet even here, he is absent, his rule mediated through atmosphere, not appearance. He is not a figure, but a principle, the embodiment of corrupted authority and illegitimate knowledge. His title suggests sovereignty, yet there is no kingdom left to rule, only ruins and echoes. It is not that the king reigns over Carcosa, but that Carcosa is the condition of his presence. He is a monarch of unplace and unbeing. Consider carefully. The king's power is not exercised through violence or command, but through disclosure. To know of him is already to be known by him. This asymmetry mirrors Gnostic theology, in which the demiurge, the false god who rules the material world, enforces ignorance through illusion. The King in Yellow may operate in similar fashion, not as the bringer of madness, but as the one who reveals that sanity itself was the illusion. The mask he wears is therefore not to conceal his face, but to reflect the viewers. When the mask drops, one does not see the king, but something far worse, oneself, untethered from all comforting lies. This inversion, where recognition becomes obliteration, echoes the ancient trope of the divine gaze, found in myths where seeing a god, such as Zeus or Yahweh, results in death. The king, however, does not kill, he reconfigures. Surrounding the king are the ruined cities and cursed landscapes of Carcosa, Hali, and the twin moons that orbit a shattered sky. These are not settings in the conventional sense. They are psychic spaces. Carcosa, first mentioned in Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, was originally a ghostly city seen by a dead man, a place where time and identity collapse. Chambers takes this concept and deepens it. Carcosa is no longer just a city. It is a recursive location, a symbol of narrative collapse. It reappears across stories with varying degrees of visibility, often in the periphery, like a half-remembered word or a dream one cannot shake. Its defining feature is not architecture, but atmosphere, mists, ruins, moons, stars that are black, a cosmological impossibility. In such places, logic fails. The landscape becomes allegory, entropy given form. Lake Holly, frequently mentioned alongside Carcosa, serves as the myth's horizon, a boundary that both reflects and obscures. Like the river Styx or the ocean of dreams in Hindu cosmology, Holly marks a threshold between states of being. Its waters are never fully described, only invoked. One passage suggests, "Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake, the shadows lengthen," in Carcosa. Again, what is crucial is the feeling, the suggestion of something immense, cyclic, and unknowable. The lake becomes a mirror, not just for the sky, but for the mind that dares to comprehend it. It is not a body of water, it is the fluid boundary of reality itself. To cross it is to be rewritten. Then there is Hastur, a name that, ironically, becomes more defined as it leaves Chambers' hands. Originally a benign shepherd god in Bierce's writing, Hastur is absorbed into Chambers' mythology as a whispered presence. In Chambers' work, he is not a character, but a word, one that carries weight, dread, and implication. His identity is never explained. He is perhaps a god, a place, or a contagion. Later writers, most notably August Derleth and H.P. Lovecraft, attempted to pin Hastur down, casting him variously as a great old one, a sibling of Cthulhu, or a symbol of decay. But this literalization arguably diminishes the power Chambers had conjured. In The King in Yellow, Hastur is terrifying precisely because he is undefined. He is a placeholder for dread, a syllable that infects the text like a mutating virus. What we see, then, is not a mythology in the traditional sense, no genealogies, no heroic cycles, but a network of conceptual entities. The king, Carcosa, Hali, Hastur, each is a point of symbolic disruption. They operate more like black holes than planets. They do not emit meaning, they absorb it. Their power lies in suggestion, in the voids they create within the narrative. They function similarly to the figures in dream analysis or alchemical allegory, enigmatic, shape-shifting, and deeply personal. Each reader brings a different interpretation, and in doing so, becomes part of the myth's evolution. This mythos is not static. It is interactive, its ambiguity, its strength. We must recognize that these entities are not enemies in the conventional sense. There are no battles to be fought, no victories to be won. The king does not chase, he waits. Carcosa does not move, it is remembered. Hastur does not strike, he is spoken of. This passivity is key. The horror is not in confrontation but in exposure. One does not fight the yellow sign, one sees it. And once seen, the self begins to dissolve like ink in water. These entities function as ontological solvents, dissolving the boundaries that define subjectivity, language, and time. They are not outside forces pressing inward, they are inner truths pressing outward. As we move into the next section, this ontological destabilization takes center stage. What happens when humans encounter these forces, not as mythic abstractions, but as realities they must live with? How does the mind react when confronted with knowledge it cannot assimilate? We will now explore the psychological consequences of encountering the yellow sign, the mechanisms of madness, the structure of transformation, and the idea that sanity itself may be a fragile veil over a much older truth. The tragedy of the yellow sign is not found in monstrous confrontation, but in recognition. Humanity's contact with the forces behind the sign, whether the King in Yellow, Carcosa, or the forbidden play itself, results in a transformation that is not mere madness, but a kind of inverted enlightenment. Chambers' characters do not lose their minds randomly. They see too much, and in seeing, they become incapable of returning to the fragile normalcy that once sustained them. The function of madness within this mythos is therefore not a narrative punishment, but a metaphysical consequence. It is the inevitable cost of perception in a universe where knowledge and ruin are indistinguishable. From the earliest stories in The King in Yellow, we observe that madness operates as both theme and mechanism. In The Repairer of Reputations, Hildred Castaigne emerges from an asylum convinced that he is the heir to a secret empire ruled by the King in Yellow. His delusion is grandiose, apocalyptic, and self-justifying. Yet Chambers refuses to confirm whether Hildred's visions are false. The story's world is already altered, filled with ominous social decrees, masked officials, and pervasive unease. The reader is caught between psychological diagnosis and cosmic implication. Is Hildred insane, or has he glimpsed a truth too large for others to perceive? This ambiguity is deliberate. Chambers anticipates what later philosophers like Michel Foucault and R.D. Laing would describe as the cultural relativity of madness. That insanity is not deviation from truth, but an alternate form of perceiving it. The horror, then, lies not in insanity itself, but in the recognition that madness may be the most accurate response to reality. We must pause here to note that Chambers' portrayal of insanity diverges sharply from the Gothic tradition that preceded him. In earlier Gothic works, such as Jane Eyre or The Fall of the House of Usher, madness is the byproduct of moral failure or hereditary curse, serving as a moralized warning. In Chambers' world, by contrast, madness is epistemological. It stems from the breakdown of the relationship between perception and meaning. When characters read The King in Yellow or glimpse the sign, their minds do not snap in the melodramatic sense. Rather, they enter a state of cognitive dissonance where all symbols lose coherence. The sign does not drive them insane. It reveals that their sanity was a form of repression. Consider carefully, what collapses is not their psyche, but the illusion that language and reason can contain the real. This idea, that madness may be the truer perception, is mirrored in the symbolist and decadent movements from which Chambers emerged. In Huysmans à rebours, 1884, the aesthete des esseintes retreats from the world into isolation, pursuing beauty until it becomes poison. Chambers amplifies this motif, transforming aesthetic obsession into ontological peril. The artist Mr. Scott in The Yellow Sign suffers not from hallucinations, but from a fatal sensitivity to form and meaning. His dreams of the graveyard watcher precede real events, suggesting that perception has crossed into premonition. The symbolist conviction that art reveals unseen realities here becomes a curse. To perceive beauty in its truest form is to witness the machinery of decay that underlies it. In this sense, Chambers anticipates Freud's notion of the return of the repressed, 1915. That which consciousness denies inevitably resurfaces in distorted form. Madness in The King in Yellow is precisely this resurfacing, reality intruding where it is not wanted, through the cracks of aesthetic experience. Yet there is a paradox embedded in this structure of madness. Those afflicted by the yellow sign are simultaneously victims and witnesses. They are cursed to see the world as it truly is, disordered, decaying, and cyclical, and thus cannot participate in the comforting fictions that sustain ordinary life. Their madness is a form of vision. This inversion, where insanity becomes a higher order of awareness, appears in numerous mystical traditions. In certain Gnostic sects, enlightenment was described as a rupture of mind, a shattering of illusion so profound it resembled madness to the uninitiated. Similarly, in Taoist and Zen philosophies, the enlightened individual may appear mad because their perception no longer conforms to consensual reality. Chambers transforms this mystical insight into existential horror. His madmen are mystics without solace, those who have achieved revelation without transcendence. This dynamic is reinforced by the contagious nature of knowledge in Chambers' fiction. Madness spreads not through physical proximity, but through interpretation. To read the play, to see the sign, even to hear of it, is to risk infection. Knowledge becomes viral. This anticipates what modern information theorists and cultural critics have called the mimetic nature of ideas, concepts that replicate themselves by hijacking attention and emotion. The yellow sign operates as a proto-meme, a cognitive parasite that cannot be quarantined. Every attempt to describe it, even in negation, furthers its spread. In this way, Chambers' stories perform what they depict. The act of reading about the yellow sign mirrors the fictional character's exposure to it. The text itself becomes an instrument of contamination, implicating the reader as both observer and participant. We must recognize, therefore, that madness in Chambers' world is not chaos, but alignment. It is the mind synchronizing with a universe that was always broken. The so-called insane have simply ceased pretending otherwise. Hildred Castaigne's conviction that he is heir to an invisible empire mirrors the modern individual's faith in systems, nation, reason, art, that promise coherence but deliver control. Mr. Scott's visions of decay reflect the decay already present in the culture around him. Aestheticism reduced to ornament, religion to ritual, language to hollow gesture. Their descent is not moral failure, it is revelation. The madman becomes prophet because he has glimpsed what others cannot bear to see. As Nietzsche wrote in The Gay Science, 1882, "When you stare long into an abyss, the abyss also stares into you." Chambers' genius was to translate that abyss into symbol form, the yellow sign, as a mirror of cognition itself. In this sense, the function of madness in The King in Yellow is both narrative and philosophical. It demonstrates the consequences of a world where knowledge has no hierarchy, where all truths, once revealed, lead to annihilation. Madness becomes the ultimate democratization of experience. Everyone who learns the secret suffers equally. It is not punishment, but equilibrium. And yet, this equilibrium is intolerable for human consciousness, which depends on illusion to survive. The yellow sign thus represents the anti-human condition, par excellence. It annihilates difference, collapses distinctions, and reveals the mind's fragility. To engage with it is to participate in entropy. As we transition to the next section, we must confront the final stage of this philosophical contagion, the idea of forbidden knowledge itself. What is it about knowing that destroys the knower? Why do certain truths, once seen, erase the possibility of meaning? In the following subsection, we will examine how the yellow sign functions as a vector of epistemic collapse, a revelation that cannot be contained, resisted, or forgotten, and whose existence threatens not only sanity, but the very structure of reality that sustains it. The forbidden is not simply that which is hidden, but that which must remain hidden to preserve the coherence of the known. In The King in Yellow, Robert W. Chambers constructs a narrative ecosystem in which certain kinds of knowledge function as metaphysical pathogens, uncontainable, irreversible, and ultimately destructive to human cognition. The yellow sign, and the play from which it emanates, do not merely reveal secret truths, they undo the knower. Here, the function of horror is epistemological. It is not the content of the revelation that destroys, it is the fact of revelation itself. The universe does not punish the curious with madness. It offers them the truth, and the mind, in receiving it, unravels. This is not knowledge as power, but knowledge as entropy. We must begin by recognizing that The King in Yellow is structured around absence. The second act of the eponymous play is never quoted, never summarized, never described in any detail. Its content is unknowable, yet its consequences are precise. Those who read it lose their grip on consensus reality, suffer psychological deterioration, and often die or disappear. This is not accidental. It is the thematic core of the book. By refusing to describe the forbidden text, Chambers dramatizes its effect as a function of readerly implication. We never read the play, but we read about its effect, and in doing so, become adjacent to its corruption. Like characters within the stories, we are left to imagine its contents, and in imagining, we become participants in its contagion. The knowledge is not forbidden because of its content, but because any content would be too much. This aligns with the literary strategy of negative space, often used in mystical texts to gesture toward the ineffable by silence, absence, or negation. This treatment of forbidden knowledge resonates strongly with ancient esoteric traditions, particularly Gnostic and Hermetic thought. In Gnostic cosmology, the act of acquiring hidden knowledge, gnosis, is both liberating and lethal. One learns that the world is a prison, ruled by false gods, and that the soul must escape through recognition of its entrapment. But once that recognition occurs, nothing can return to normal. The illusion does not fade, it collapses. Chambers repurposes this structure in secular, nihilistic terms. In his stories, forbidden knowledge reveals not divinity or salvation, but the terrifying absence of order. The characters are not delivered into higher realms. They are abandoned by the very reality they believed in. Consider carefully. The knowledge itself is inert. What it annihilates is the symbolic system in which it arrives. We must pause here to distinguish between dangerous knowledge and forbidden knowledge. Dangerous knowledge threatens institutions. It is political, social, actionable. Forbidden knowledge, in contrast, threatens meaning itself. It is not what the yellow sign reveals about the world that makes it unbearable. It is what it reveals about the act of revealing. That knowledge is not a stable process, but a recursive collapse. The more one understands, the more one realizes that understanding is impossible. This is the paradox at the heart of epistemic collapse. The yellow sign is a symbol of this paradox, an emblem that transmits not information, but the failure of information systems. It does not communicate a secret, it undoes the ability to distinguish between secrecy and revelation. Examples throughout Chambers' collection demonstrate this process. In The Yellow Sign, Mr. Scott's dreams of a watchman culminate in the arrival of a cadaverous figure whose presence shatters his sense of reality. The sign appears as a token, small, innocuous, but psychically viral. Once received, it cannot be forgotten. It behaves less like a curse and more like an irreversible recognition. The mind has glimpsed a structure behind perception, and that structure is not coherent, but recursive. This mirrors the Lacanian notion of the real, the traumatic kernel of experience that cannot be symbolized and thus returns as horror. The yellow sign is not real in the physical sense, but it functions as the real. It is the event that language cannot metabolize, and in failing to do so, language collapses. This is why Chambers' horror is not localized. It spreads. Madness begins in individuals, but as we read the stories, we see society subtly eroded, legal systems that feel arbitrary, cityscapes that shift, moral boundaries that blur. The effect is systemic. The knowledge disseminated by the yellow sign is not knowledge of anything. It is knowledge against knowing. We might call this a form of cognitive antimatter. Wherever it goes, structure disintegrates. The self, the social, the sacred, all fall before its touch. In this sense, the yellow sign is not a plot device, but a narrative function. It dissolves plot, setting, character, even genre. It is metafictional entropy, a device that enacts what it depicts. What makes this especially disturbing is that the sign's effects cannot be defended against. One cannot unknow what has been seen. In classical horror, characters might escape, close the book, burn the artifact. But Chambers offers no such relief. The forbidden knowledge is not contained. It is enacted by the story itself. To read the story is to become vulnerable. In this, Chambers again anticipates later developments in the horror literature and theory, particularly Thomas Ligotti's concept of the narrative hazard, stories that, once read, make the reader complicit in the collapse they describe. As Ligotti writes in The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, to learn the truth is not worth the cost of knowing it. Chambers reached the same conclusion a century earlier, with far fewer words and with far more silence. We must recognize, finally, that epistemic collapse in Chambers' work is not a warning. It is a prophecy. The yellow sign was never meant to be deciphered, solved, or resolved. It was designed to fail. Its horror lies in its success. To see it is to enter as Iashi, a system where meaning is recursive, unstable, and self-consuming. The self, once exposed to such knowledge, begins to mirror the symbol itself, fragmented, illegible, contagious. Madness, then, is not a side effect, but a structural mirror of the universe. A mind that sees too clearly must become like what it sees. And so, as we close this thematic arc, we are left with a troubling possibility that Chambers' stories do not merely describe forbidden knowledge, but transmit it. That the reader, having followed the signs, is now marked, not with madness perhaps, but with the suspicion that all meaning is already rotting from within. In the next part of this study, we will turn from philosophical implication to textual manifestation, analyzing how these themes take form in narrative. What stories first bore the yellow sign into the world, and how has it been interpreted, distorted, and sustained by those who came after? When The King in Yellow appeared in 1895, it emerged not as an isolated work of horror, but as a strange literary convergence, where decadent aesthetics, Gothic form, and symbolist mysticism intertwined to create something that felt both ancient and modern. The stories in Chambers' collection, particularly The Repairer of Reputations, The Mask, In the Court of the Dragon, and The Yellow Sign, each approach the myth obliquely, refracting it through fragments rather than exposition. The yellow sign itself is mentioned directly in only one story, yet its influence pervades all. What unites these tales is not plot or setting, but atmosphere, a recurring sense that art and madness, beauty and death, perception and reality have merged into a single, incurable condition. It is in this tension that we find the earliest literary manifestation of cosmic horror before Lovecraft had given it a name. We must begin with The Repairer of Reputations, the opening and most complex story of the collection. Set in a near-future America, circa 1920, the tale presents an alternate history where suicide is legalized, eugenics is normalized, and political power is centralized under a vaguely authoritarian state. Within this unsettling context, the narrator Hildred Castaigne emerges as both visionary and lunatic. Having suffered a head injury and subsequent institutionalization, he claims to be heir to an imperial dynasty governed by the mysterious King in Yellow. Chambers' genius lies in narrative ambiguity. We are never sure whether Hildred's reality is delusional or prophetic. He speaks of the imperial dynasty of America, a secret empire whose symbol is the yellow sign. Yet the story's world is itself warped, a plausible yet estranged mirror of modernity. This technique of limited unreliability anticipates Kafka's bureaucratic nightmares and later postmodern metafiction. The reader, trapped between belief and disbelief, experiences precisely what the yellow sign induces: epistemic vertigo. Each story's language reinforces this effect. Hildred describes the forbidden play as a text that drives men mad, those few who are bold enough to read beyond the second act. The phrasing is clinical, detached, as though madness were a documented side effect of intellectual exposure. The play's existence is both proven and impossible. Its fragments quoted throughout the collection, Casilda's song, the mention of Carcosa, form a poetic refrain that haunts all subsequent narratives. These textual echoes create the illusion of an interconnected universe, one where fragments of myth appear like recovered scriptures. Chambers' innovation here was profound. He introduced the idea of the fictional artifact, a book within a book whose existence destabilizes both the narrative and the reader. Lovecraft, Borges, and later writers like Mark Z. Danielewski would all borrow this device to blur the line between reading and experiencing. The yellow sign, therefore, represents not merely a symbol in the story, but a meta-symbol for fiction's ability to contaminate reality. The second major story, The Mask, is quieter but thematically essential. It takes place among artists and scientists in Paris, where a new chemical formula can petrify living organisms, transforming flesh into marble. The protagonist, Boris Yvain, and his companion, the painter Alec, grapple with the aesthetic and moral consequences of this discovery. Here, the play The King in Yellow is mentioned only in passing, yet its influence permeates the narrative through motifs of transformation, imitation, and the blurring of art and life. When Boris's lover, Genevieve, is accidentally subjected to the petrifying process, the narrative shifts from scientific curiosity to existential despair. The transmutation from life to art is no triumph, it is a death that masquerades as beauty. Chambers' treatment of this theme prefigures what would later be called aesthetic fatalism, the notion that perfect art annihilates its subject. In this story, the forbidden knowledge is not cosmic but creative. To imitate life perfectly is to destroy it. In this sense, the mask serves as an allegory for the yellow sign itself, a sign that transforms the observer, turning vitality into permanence, consciousness into object. In the Court of the Dragon offers a different angle, shifting from artistic obsession to spiritual dread. The story's unnamed narrator attends Mass in a Parisian church and becomes haunted by the organist, who seems to follow him beyond the boundaries of space and time. The tale is brief and hallucinatory, structured like a recurring dream. The church becomes a labyrinth of shifting aisles and echoing footsteps, the organ music an oppressive rhythm that merges prayer with pursuit. The climactic revelation, I had been in the Court of the Dragon all my life, transforms the story from psychological to metaphysical horror. The Dragon's Court, like Carcosa, is not a place but a condition, eternal entrapment within perception. The yellow sign itself is not named here, yet its symbolic structure is replicated. It is the same function in another key, revelation as imprisonment, awareness as doom. The story's cyclical ending prefigures the modernist idea of temporal recursion, later echoed in works such as Proust's In Search of Lost Time and the temporal paradoxes of Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time. Chambers' innovation is subtle. His characters do not discover monsters. They become trapped in cognition itself. The Yellow Sign, perhaps the most famous tale, distills all of these elements into a single, self-contained nightmare. The protagonist, an artist named Scott, dreams of a cemetery watchman who stares at him through a window. Later, he encounters a physical counterpart to the dream figure, an emaciated, corpse-like man who delivers a small box containing the Yellow Sign. Scott's model and companion, Tessie, finds the sign beautiful, not realizing its corruption. After discovering that the watchman has died, only to see him again in her apartment, both characters spiral into madness and death. The horror here is not sudden, but cumulative. It arises from repetition, from the gradual fusion of dream and waking life. The Yellow Sign functions as both catalyst and mirror. It reveals the world's rotting framework beneath the thin layer of sanity. When Tessie whispers, "It's the Yellow Sign. I knew it when I saw it," her recognition seals their fate. Knowledge is contagion. Awareness is terminal. Chambers' recurring motifs, dreams, manuscripts, doubles, art as contagion, establish the foundation upon which the later Cthulhu mythos would be built. Lovecraft's The Whisperer in Darkness and The Call of Cthulhu replicate this structure of forbidden discovery, documents that reveal, investigators who disintegrate, readers who are implicated. Yet where Lovecraft's entities are vast and external, Chambers are intimate and aesthetic. His horrors do not arrive from the stars, but from the mind's insistence on coherence. The Yellow Sign is not a cosmic beacon, but a human mirror. This internalization makes Chambers' work uniquely modern. It anticipates the psychoanalytic horror of Freud's uncanny, the self-referential dread of postmodernism, and the existential disquiet that dominates the 20th century's literature of alienation. We must recognize, finally, that Chambers' method of myth-making through fragmented intertextuality, borrowing from Bierce's Carcosa, inventing false texts, leaving gaps for the reader to fill, became the structural DNA of modern horror. The Yellow Sign's earliest appearances are not limited to his own fiction. They echo through later adaptations, parodies, and expansions that treat it as both symbol and virus. What begins in Chambers' stories as literary device becomes, over time, a shared language among authors who seek to reproduce the same sense of epistemic unease. It is not simply that the Yellow Sign endures, it propagates. Its earliest forms are incomplete, because incompletion is the condition of its survival. As we turn next to the detailed analysis of Chambers' most haunting case studies, The Yellow Sign and The Repairer of Reputations, we will see how these stories crystallize the myth's dual nature, as psychological revelation and metaphysical contagion. Through close reading, we can trace how Chambers' experiment in fragmented storytelling evolved into the prototype of modern cosmic horror, one where the boundary between fiction and truth collapses completely. Among the tales in The King in Yellow, none encapsulates Chambers' synthesis of beauty, dread, and metaphysical ruin more fully than The Yellow Sign. It is, in many ways, the core text of the entire collection, the only story where the Yellow Sign is named explicitly, where its effects are rendered in horrifying detail, and where the symbolic weight of the entire mythos collapses directly onto the characters. And yet, despite its centrality, the story remains deeply elusive. It does not explain, it enacts. It is not a cautionary tale, but a transmission designed to reproduce in the reader the same sense of slow, inevitable psychic erosion that afflicts its doomed protagonists. Through its use of visual symbolism, dream logic, and recursive narrative structure, The Yellow Sign performs its horror rather than describes it, forcing us to question the very stability of the text, and by extension, our own perception. The story's narrator, Mr. Scott, is a New York artist of some cultural prestige, engaged in the creation of religious-themed paintings with the assistance of his model, Tessie. At the story's opening, Scott recounts a disturbing dream in which he wanders through a church graveyard, watched silently by a motionless man in a faded Beatles uniform, a dream that leaves him unsettled long after waking. Shortly thereafter, he encounters a similarly deformed, sickly man watching him from the street. An emaciated figure with pale skin and sunken eyes, who is eventually revealed to be a night watchman employed at the nearby church. "He looked as though he had been dead for a week," Scott remarks, And indeed, death and undeath form the metaphysical framework of the tale. The Watchman, like the sign itself, is an impossible thing, a liminal figure who should not be there, whose presence violates the boundary between dream and waking life. He is not a monster, but a marker, a living portent. This recursive structure, where dreams predict and then bleed into waking reality, initiates the epistemic collapse that defines the story. Tessie, the artist's companion and confidant, finds the yellow sign among Scott's effects, claiming, "I saw it in your safe. I knew it was the yellow sign. You can't deceive me." The moment is brief, almost casual, yet it signals a profound turning point. Tessie does not learn the sign's name from anyone. She recognizes it, as if it had always been part of her internal world. This suggests what we must now call inherent contamination. The idea that the yellow sign does not transmit through ordinary means, but through a deeper resonance, something dormant in the psyche that the symbol awakens. The sign does not teach, it reminds. This mirrors the Gnostic concept of anamnesis, the knowledge that is not learned but remembered. In this way, the sign does not function as a narrative clue, but as a metaphysical trigger. The most unsettling aspect of the yellow sign is the way it aestheticizes terror. Chambers constructs scenes of beauty and intimacy. Scott and Tessie's working relationship, their flirtation, the religious art they produce, all of which become corrupted without fanfare. When Tessie falls ill, there is no supernatural storm or sudden chaos. Instead, she weakens quietly. The sign's presence induces no visible hauntings, no monstrous appearances. The only horror is time itself, accelerated, inevitable, and final. Her illness, like the sign, is not a punishment, but a process, a slow turning inward, a consumption of structure. As her health deteriorates, so does the integrity of the world around them. The story mimics the decay it describes, accelerating toward collapse without narrative explanation. The Watchman returns in the story's final act, forcing entry into Scott's home and attacking Tessie as she lies in bed. Chambers writes, "He dragged her out of the bed, and I saw the man was dead." This line, stark and unadorned, lands with almost biblical gravity. The undead Watchman becomes the physical manifestation of the sign's symbolic force, not a zombie in the pulpy sense, but a revenant of meaninglessness. His intrusion is not a supernatural anomaly, but an epistemological one, the breakdown of categories, the invasion of the real by the unreal. Scott, in trying to resist him, is shot, and the final paragraph closes not on his death, but on the implication that death is no longer the terminus of experience. The sign, having entered both characters' lives, ensures that death becomes recursive, a condition of being rather than its end. "I shall see her soon," Scott says, a line that is less romantic than it is fatalistic. The sign's contagion is eternal. We must pause here to examine how the story's use of space reinforces its themes. The narrative unfolds almost entirely within Scott's apartment, yet this domestic space becomes increasingly permeable, first by dreams, then by symbols, and finally by the undead. Chambers uses the familiar as a stage for the uncanny, destabilizing not only the characters' perceptions, but the readers as well. The apartment is not haunted in the traditional sense. Rather, it is the site of convergence, where symbolic, mental, and material realities overlap. This architectural function mirrors the concept of the threshold, long recognized in ritual studies as the space where transformation occurs. The apartment, like the mind, becomes the chamber in which forbidden knowledge performs its rites. Critically, the yellow sign is also Chambers' most self-referential story. It is a narrative about an artist destroyed by perception, a symbol too potent to depict, and a text whose knowledge cannot be contained. In this way, the story becomes metafictional, anticipating later works like Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, where reading itself is a form of descent. The reader of The Yellow Sign is not an outsider. They are cast in the same position as Tessie, fascinated by the sign, unsure of its meaning, but compelled to look. And once one has looked, the story implies one is already changed. This mirrors the recursive structure we have traced throughout this study. To read the sign is to carry it. The narrative function of the yellow sign is therefore dual. On the surface, it dramatizes a symbolic infection and personal descent. On a deeper level, it allegorizes the act of reading horror itself. The sign represents the reader's desire to understand what cannot be understood, to know what literature is not meant to reveal. The more one engages with the story, the more one realizes that the sign is not merely in the text. It is the text. Chambers has embedded the very form of epistemic collapse into the narrative structure, forcing us to inhabit the same condition as his characters. As we move to the next major story, The Repairer of Reputations, we will see how Chambers expands this approach to narrative madness. There, the yellow sign does not emerge through aesthetic contamination, but through political and historical distortion, suggesting that the sign's effects are not only individual, but civilizational. The madness of perception is not confined to the artist's studio. It infects the world stage. And what we find is perhaps even more disturbing: the possibility that society itself may be constructed atop the ruins of such signs, such plays, such kings. If the yellow sign is Chambers' study in intimate madness, the corrosion of two minds by a single symbol, then The Repairer of Reputations is his grand experiment in social hallucination. It is the longest, strangest, and most structurally ambitious of the King in Yellow stories, a work that initially appears to be speculative fiction, but gradually reveals itself as something far more insidious. A treatise on delusion disguised as world-building. Set in a dystopian New York of 1920, a date still 25 years in the future when Chambers wrote it, the story imagines a society transformed by the legalization of suicide, by militarized nationalism, and by a mysterious political cult centered on the King in Yellow. Yet beneath this veneer of alternative history lies a far deeper question: what happens when madness becomes indistinguishable from civilization itself? In exploring that question, Chambers creates a story that operates simultaneously as prophecy, mirror, and contagion, a blueprint for the modern condition of epistemic instability. The narrator, Hildred Castaigne, introduces himself as a survivor of a head injury and a stay in an asylum. He insists upon his recovery, his rationality, his impeccable lineage. I had never been insane except upon occasions when my imagination was permitted to gain ascendancy over my reason, he declares, a sentence that both reassures and undermines itself. Hildred's New York is recognizable, yet altered, a world of airships, state-controlled euthanasia chambers, and a pervasive mood of bureaucratic dread. Within this distorted society, he believes himself to be the rightful heir to the imperial dynasty of America, a secret monarchy destined to replace the democratic republic. His claim is validated, he insists, by the mysterious Mr. Wilde, the repairer of reputations of the title, an eccentric recluse who lives with a violent cat and keeps dossiers on the city's citizens. Yet, as the narrative unfolds, it becomes impossible to distinguish between conspiracy and delusion. Mr. Wilde might be a political mastermind, or simply another inmate escaped from the asylum. The story refuses resolution, leaving us trapped in Hildred's oscillating perception. This deliberate ambiguity is not merely a stylistic choice, it is the story's core mechanism. Chambers constructs a world where political paranoia and personal insanity coexist so seamlessly that they validate one another. Hildred's belief in the yellow sign and the King in Yellow gives cosmic grandeur to his otherwise pitiful delusion. His madness is not random, it is structured. The forbidden play functions as a kind of scripture, a document that grants coherence to chaos. It is said that those who have read the accursed play are forever after branded by the yellow sign, Hildred notes, his tone oscillating between reverence and fear. In his mind, the play's madness becomes political order. His personal delusion expands into theology. We must recognize here that Chambers has inverted the usual structure of horror. The protagonist is not destroyed after reading forbidden knowledge. He constructs an entire social world from it. Madness, in this story, is not collapse, but creation. The political implications of this transformation are chillingly prescient. The repairer of reputations predates the rise of totalitarian regimes, yet it anticipates their psychological architecture, the merging of paranoia, mythology, and authoritarian order. Hildred's imperial dynasty mirrors the fascist dreams of the 20th century, where myth becomes policy and conspiracy becomes governance. The King in Yellow, in this context, functions as the perfect authoritarian symbol. vague, transcendent, and self-justifying. It requires no doctrine, only devotion. The yellow sign becomes a mark of belonging, an emblem of the initiated. It is not a badge of shame, but of superiority, proof of access to forbidden truth. In this way, Chambers foreshadows the sociological concept of ideological possession, the moment when belief ceases to be voluntary and becomes structural. Hildred's mind is not merely corrupted by the sign, it is organized by it. Consider carefully how Chambers uses urban space to reflect this cognitive disintegration. The story's New York is both familiar and unreal, its streets renamed, its buildings repurposed. The lethal chamber, a public institution where citizens can die voluntarily, stands as both literal and symbolic monument. It embodies the paradox of modernity, a bureaucratic system that sanitizes death, transforming despair into civic ritual. Hildred describes the lethal chamber with reverence, calling it a triumph of science and social order, yet the reader perceives it as macabre. This doubling of perspective, one rational, one horrified, repeats throughout the story. The physical city mirrors Hildred's mental architecture, structured, efficient, and utterly deranged. In this sense, The Repairer of Reputations anticipates Franz Kafka's The Trial, 1925, where the machinery of order conceals an abyss of absurdity. Chambers intuited, decades early, that insanity could be systemic rather than individual. We must pause here to observe the peculiar role of Mr. Wilde. On the surface, he is Hildred's co-conspirator, a grotesque figure who collects secrets, manipulates reputations, and validates the narrator's imperial fantasies. But symbolically, Wilde is an extension of the yellow sign itself. He repairs by corrupting. He restores by rewriting. His name, echoing Oscar Wilde, links him to decadence and artifice, suggesting that reputation, like sanity, is a performance. The cat that lives with him, violent, ever watching, recalls the Egyptian motif of the divine familiar, or perhaps the Freudian uncanny double. Wilde is both human and not. His death at the story's end, mauled by his own pet, completes the narrative's descent into self-devouring logic. The system consumes its architect. This recursive destruction mirrors the sign's own function. Every act of control leads to disintegration. At the story's climax, Hildred enacts his imagined destiny, attempting to assassinate his cousin Louis, the supposed usurper of his throne. He is restrained and institutionalized once again, though the text never confirms the outcome. The final line, "They are looking for me in the corridors now," places the reader in the impossible position of uncertainty. Is Hildred narrating from within an asylum, or from within Carcosa itself? The distinction collapses. Chambers refuses closure, leaving us suspended in what we might call ontological ambiguity, the condition of being unable to tell whether the world is real or imagined. It is precisely this ambiguity that transforms the story from psychological fiction into metaphysical horror. Madness becomes not a deviation from reality, but a revelation of its structure. We must recognize, too, the meta-literary implications of Hildred's narrative. His unreliable voice prefigures the modernist stream of consciousness later perfected by Faulkner and Joyce. But where they sought interior truth, Chambers sought interior contagion. The act of reading Hildred's words mimics the infection of the yellow sign itself. His logic is coherent, persuasive, and poisoned. The reader, drawn into his system, begins to see the pattern, to momentarily inhabit his delusion. This effect, both subtle and cumulative, is the story's most dangerous achievement. It performs the very collapse it describes. Reader and narrator, sanity and insanity, truth and fiction, each reflecting, consuming, and reproducing the other. In the broader context of the King and Yellow mythos, the Repairer of Reputations represents the sign's most expansive form. It is no longer an artifact passed between individuals, but an organizing principle capable of reshaping societies. Madness here is scalable. Hildred's empire, imaginary or not, foreshadows a world in which entire cultures can adopt the logic of the sign, where delusion becomes consensus and truth becomes performance. Chambers, perhaps unknowingly, anticipates the epistemic crises of modernity, propaganda, mass hysteria, and the recursive echo chambers of belief that now define our digital age. The story's prophetic resonance is unsettling, not because it describes insanity, but because it describes us. As we move to the next section, we must follow this trajectory beyond Chambers himself, to the writers who expanded, codified, and diluted his mythos. How did later authors, Derleth, Lovecraft, and their successors, inherit the yellow sign's contagion? Did they preserve its ambiguity or domesticate its terror into taxonomy? The answers reveal how a single unnameable symbol evolved from decadent fiction into the shared scripture of cosmic horror. The mythology of the King in Yellow, as originally conceived by Robert W. Chambers, was deliberately fragmented, unstable, and recursive. A mythology that operated by implication rather than elaboration. Yet its very incompleteness made it fertile ground for later writers seeking to connect, expand, and systematize the mythology into something more consistent, even if that meant taming some of its original ambiguity. In this final subsection of Part 3, we explore how Chambers' strange and suggestive ideas were transformed by authors like H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth, who folded the yellow sign and its associated names, Carcosa, Hastur, the King, into the ever-growing mythos of cosmic horror. The result is a dual legacy. On one hand, a broader narrative architecture that elevated Chambers' motifs to the level of modern folklore. On the other, a simplification that sometimes flattened the philosophical unease of the original into monstrous taxonomy. It is commonly believed that H.P. Lovecraft was the first to graft Chambers' ideas into his own mythos. But in truth, Lovecraft's engagement with the King in Yellow was more peripheral than central. He read Chambers' collection and admired its atmosphere, noting in a 1927 letter that its early tales contained a malign and particular sensation of unnatural horror and suggestion. Lovecraft never used the yellow sign directly, nor did he invoke Carcosa or Lake Holly in his fiction. Instead, he referenced Hastur, originally a benevolent deity in Barris and a vague symbol in Chambers, in passing, particularly in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, where Hastur is associated with the alien Mygo. Yet Lovecraft's genius lay in his willingness to preserve ambiguity. His use of names like Nyarlathotep or Azathoth maintained a sense of metaphysical indeterminacy. These were not gods in the traditional sense, but avatars of cosmic indifference, entities that resisted anthropocentric comprehension. The King in Yellow, in this context, was never fully absorbed into Lovecraft's system. He remained in the margins, a ghostly interloper from a parallel aesthetic tradition. It was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and the co-founder of Arkham House, who most directly altered the mythos, codifying, systematizing, and moralizing it in ways that significantly transformed its philosophical core. Derleth took the loose collection of ideas scattered across Lovecraft's and Chambers' work and sorted them into a quasi-theological structure, complete with elemental associations, antagonistic factions, the Great Old Ones versus the Elder Gods, and a kind of cosmic battle between good and evil. Within this structure, Hastur was assigned a specific identity, a Great Old One associated with the element of air, sometimes portrayed as a rival to Cthulhu, and an ally of the outer gods. The King in Yellow, in Derleth's hands, was sometimes merged with or subordinated to Hastur, turning him from a symbol of epistemic collapse into a defined entity, a thing that could be referenced, cataloged, even confronted. The yellow sign, once a formless cipher, was rendered as a literal mark, often a twisted glyph or rune, standardized in tabletop games and fan fiction. We must pause here to recognize what was lost in this process. Chambers' original horror depended on not knowing, on the absence of fixed meaning. The yellow sign was terrifying because it was semantically unstable, never described, never understood, always operating as a mirror for the reader's dread. Derleth's mythologization, though expansive, necessarily diminished this effect. By placing the King in Yellow on a cosmic flowchart, by aligning him with other Great Old Ones, he was transformed from an anti-symbol into a character subject to lore. Horror, in this schema, became a matter of threat level rather than ontological crisis. The King was no longer the sovereign of unknowing. He was another monster on the list. This reveals something about the limitations of shared mythologies. They enable narrative expansion, but often at the cost of interpretive depth. The more defined the sign becomes, the less dangerous it is. Yet not all later authors followed Derleth's lead. Some, like Carl Edward Wagner, Joseph Pulver, and Thomas Ligotti, returned to Chambers' original ambiguity and deepened it. Wagner's stories, such as The River of Night's Dreaming, 1981, embrace the dreamlike logic of the original tales, portraying the King in Yellow not as a villain but as a metaphysical principle, an intruder from a higher order of reality. Joseph Pulver Sr., in works like Blood Will Have Its Season, 2009, experiments with stream of consciousness prose and fragmented narrative to mimic the disorientation of exposure to the yellow sign. These authors treat Chambers not as a source of canon, but as a source of contagion, recreating the effect of his fiction rather than extending its mythology. Their work resists the gravitational pull of the Cthulhu mythos, preserving the aesthetic fatalism and psychological decay that define the Yellow King's true domain. This post-Chambers tradition also finds expression in modern metafiction and horror-adjacent media. Alan Moore's Providence, 2015-17, for instance, draws directly from Chambers, integrating Carcosa and the King in Yellow into a broader meditation on the power of fiction to alter reality. Similarly, True Detective Season 1, 2014, invokes the mythos through oblique references, Carcosa, Black Stars, a Yellow King, without ever explaining them. The result is precisely what Chambers would have intended, a narrative haunted by something that cannot be understood, only implied. The horror lies not in the name, but in its repetition. These works recognize that the yellow sign is not a puzzle to be solved, but a ritual to be reenacted. Consider carefully, the afterlife of the yellow sign is not linear, but viral. It spreads not through logical continuity, but through symbolic contagion. Chambers' symbol survives because it resists definition, because it allows each new author to project their own anxieties onto it. It becomes a lens, not a thing. Even the modern resurgence of the sign in games like Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green, where it often appears as a badge of madness or cult allegiance, testifies to its adaptability. These interpretations may lack Chambers' philosophical subtlety, but they prove the symbol's potency. Once introduced, it cannot be uninvented. It persists, mutating through context, medium, and culture. We must recognize, then, that the collaborative expansion of the yellow sign mythos is both an enrichment and a dilution. Derleth gave it structure, others restored its ambiguity. The tension between these approaches reflects a deeper truth, that horror thrives in contradiction. The yellow sign is most terrifying when it means too much and not enough, when it appears familiar but remains unreadable. Its endurance depends not on canon, but on rupture. Like a dream that follows you into waking life, the yellow sign endures by refusing to resolve. As we turn toward the final movement of this investigation, its cultural and psychological afterlife, we will trace how this symbol, born from a literary fragment in the 1890s, has insinuated itself into the fabric of modern horror, folklore, and media. The yellow sign has escaped the page. But what does it mean when people begin to see it outside of fiction? On walls, in forums, in dreams? What happens when myth becomes memory? The yellow sign was born in fiction, but like all potent symbols, it did not stay there. Over time, it has slipped its textual boundaries and entered the unstable realm of cultural myth, urban legend, and shared hallucination. This is not merely a testament to Chambers' evocative prose. It is evidence of a symbol behaving like a virus, mutating, spreading, insinuating itself into memory, media, and belief. From whispered online rumors and altered photographs to supposed sightings and real-world graffiti, the yellow sign has joined the pantheon of liminal icons, images that exist in the threshold between invention and discovery. It is not simply a fictional glyph anymore. For some, it is something found, glimpsed at the edge of reason. Consider carefully, a symbol that originally signified the collapse of meaning has, paradoxically, gained cultural momentum by being incomprehensible. That is the paradox of the yellow sign. It persists because it resists. Reports of real-world yellow signs began to emerge during the early 2000s with the rise of internet horror forums, particularly those adjacent to creepypasta ARGs, alternate reality games, and digital urban legend communities like EshX on 4chan and R No Sleep on Reddit. In these forums, users began posting images of symbols carved into trees, etched onto subway walls, or hidden in the backgrounds of seemingly ordinary videos. Often, these glyphs resembled stylized variants of the yellow sign, as it had appeared in earlier visual adaptations. Spidery, spiraled, often triangular. Some users claimed to have seen the symbol in dreams before ever reading about it, triggering the idea that the sign might function retroactively, implanting itself in memory the moment one learns its name. These accounts, while unverifiable, echo a persistent theme. That knowledge of the yellow sign cannot be passively held. Once known, it acts, first as image, then as suspicion, then as fate. These modern hoaxes and legends are not isolated fabrications. They participate in a long cultural lineage of fictional texts mistaken or transformed into real ones. The Necronomicon, though a creation of H.P. Lovecraft, has appeared in the published form since the 1970s, sold in occult bookstores and used in rituals. Similarly, the Blair Witch Project, 1999, blurred fact and fiction so effectively that some viewers believed its mythos predated the film. What these examples share with the yellow sign is not authenticity, but structure. They replicate the mechanisms of belief. The yellow sign's strength lies in its design. It invites participation by withholding definition. As soon as someone encounters it, whether online or in an alleyway, they become part of the myth. The story is now theirs, and its horror, once theoretical, becomes experiential. In this way, the yellow sign mimics viral folklore, adapting itself to new formats without ever revealing its origin. Perhaps the most compelling instance of the yellow sign's real-world infiltration occurred in the wake of True Detective Season 1, 2014. The show's references to Carcosa, Black Stars, and the Yellow King sparked renewed interest in Chambers' work, prompting a wave of internet speculation and crowdsourced investigations. Fans claimed to find the sign encoded in crime scene photos, background shots, and even the show's promotional materials. This collective interpretation became a kind of folk ritual, reenacting the original story's themes of revelation and madness through online sleuthing. Notably, many participants had never read The King in Yellow, encountering the mythos secondhand, through implication rather than direct source. This is crucial. The yellow sign does not need to be read to function. Like a mimetic virus, it transmits through pattern, atmosphere, and suggestion. Its power lies not in narrative detail, but in symbolic density. We must pause here to ask a difficult question. When does fiction become folklore? Scholars of modern myth argue that repetition, fragmentation, and participatory transmission are key indicators. The yellow sign exhibits all three. Its appearances are inconsistent, often contradictory, but united by tone. Its fragments appear across media, books, forums, video games, and graffiti, each time recontextualized but never clarified. And most importantly, its life continues beyond authorship. Chambers is no longer required. The symbol now writes itself. This mirrors the transformation of other fictional constructs into quasi-real belief systems. Slender Man, The Rake, SCP Foundation entries. But the yellow sign is unique in its literary origin. It was never meant to scare children or titillate thrill seekers. It was a philosophical trap, embedded in decadent prose. That it has joined the realm of digital folklore speaks to a deeper, perhaps more troubling human impulse, to believe that there are symbols which, once seen, change us forever. This phenomenon also touches on the broader psychological function of myth in a disenchanted world. As sociologist Peter Berger argued in The Sacred Canopy, 1967, modernity strips the world of cosmic, meaning leaving individuals adrift in systems that no longer offer metaphysical comfort. In this vacuum, symbols like the yellow sign operate as re-enchantment mechanisms. They suggest that some knowledge remains dangerous, that some truths are better left buried. This is not superstition. It is a form of existential structure. The idea that a symbol could undo the self, not by magic but by implication, restores a sense of mystery to the world. In this way, the yellow sign functions like the medieval memento mori, a reminder not of physical death, but of symbolic instability. It warns not of the monster behind the curtain, but of the collapse of the curtain itself, and so, we must recognize that the yellow sign's appearance in urban legends and hoaxes is not a trivial postmodern game. It is a cultural enactment of the very horror Chambers first imagined, that fiction, once believed, becomes indistinguishable from memory, that the mind, once exposed, can never return to its prior configuration. In this way, the yellow sign's mythic persistence is not the result of marketing nor even fandom, but of structural function. It is an idea that replicates through fear, through aesthetic curiosity, through the human need for symbolic frameworks. It cannot be resolved because resolution would end the myth. As we transition to the next section, we will explore how this contagion has spread beyond literature and folklore into other forms of culture: film, music, video games, each medium reshaping the sign to fit its own aesthetic grammar. What happens when the yellow sign becomes playable, audible, collectible? Does its symbolic weight diminish, or does it only evolve, learning new languages through which to be seen? The yellow sign was never intended for the screen. Its horror, as we have seen, thrives in ambiguity, linguistic collapse, narrative fragmentation, suggestive absence. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, its resistance to visual clarity, the sign has been adapted, referenced, and reimagined across media forms. From television to video games to underground music scenes, the yellow sign has transcended its literary origins and become a symbolic motif deployed by creators seeking to evoke unease, cosmic despair, or narrative contamination. What unites these disparate adaptations is not visual consistency, but thematic convergence, a shared recognition that some stories should never be told, and some symbols should never be seen. As we will see, the yellow sign persists not because it adapts perfectly to new media, but because it fails productively, generating new forms of aesthetic rupture with each reinterpretation. Perhaps the most culturally visible resurgence of the yellow sign occurred with the premiere of True Detective Season 1 in 2014. The show, created by Nick Pizzolatto, follows two detectives investigating a series of ritualistic murders in Louisiana, gradually uncovering references to Carcosa, the Yellow King, and cryptic symbols painted on doors and bodies. While the series never explicitly shows the yellow sign, nor names it directly, its presence is unmistakable. Characters refer to a mysterious, possibly fictional manuscript. Spiral patterns recur. The line, "Strange is the night where black stars rise," is alluded to in tone, if not quotation. What True Detective achieves is not adaptation, but echo. It treats the yellow sign not as source material, but as atmosphere. The horror in the show is psychological, ritualistic, and generational. The deeper the characters dig, the more they are pulled into a network of belief, memory, and madness. Carcosa, in this context, is not a place, but a state of knowing. The sign does not appear on screen, but its logic governs the entire narrative arc. Other cinematic and televisual works have similarly flirted with the mythos without fully adapting it. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, while not referencing the yellow sign by name, is often cited as a spiritual cousin. Its plot, a horror novelist's books drive readers insane, mirrors Chambers' theme of contaminated fiction. The final sequence, where the protagonist watches a film adaptation of his own story and begins laughing in existential despair, is a perfect dramatization of what the yellow sign represents: the inability to differentiate between narrative and reality. Likewise, Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, explores the theme of epistemic collapse through a shimmer that mutates organisms and perception alike. Though these works do not directly reference Chambers, their aesthetic lineage is clear. The yellow sign, in this sense, has become a genre principle, a structure of horror rather than a discrete icon. In the realm of video games, the yellow sign has found an unexpected home. Interactive horror, with its capacity for disorientation and player complicity, provides fertile ground for Chambers' themes. The tabletop RPG Call of Cthulhu, 1981 present, based on Lovecraftian horror, often includes modules involving the king in yellow, the play, and the sign itself. In these scenarios, players are encouraged to investigate ancient cults, decipher forbidden texts, and confront the insanity that inevitably follows. The game's sanity mechanic, a gradually depleting statistic that mirrors psychological collapse, makes the yellow sign not just thematic, but mechanical. Exposure to the sign can cause permanent character loss, not because of violence, but because of knowledge. Similarly, the video game Bloodborne 2015 features heavy visual and narrative allusions to Chambers' work. Hidden beneath its Victorian Gothic facade is a world where reality is mutable and madness is revelation. Players collect insight, a mechanic that both expands perception and unlocks deeper horrors. In this world, awareness is punishment, just as it is in The King in Yellow. These games are not adaptations. They are enactments. They allow players to live the horror chambers described, to seek understanding and be punished for it. The yellow sign, in these contexts, often appears as a hidden glyph or unlockable clue. It is never fully explained, only felt. One might see it in a dream sequence, etched on a door or drawn in blood. Its function remains consistent. It marks the boundary between ignorance and awareness, and the irreversible damage of crossing it. Even games not explicitly tied to chambers, like The Sinking City 2019 or Darkest Dungeon 2016, deploy similar aesthetics, sigils, forbidden knowledge, madness mechanics, suggesting that the yellow sign has become a foundational template for interactive cosmic horror. In music, the sign has inspired a surprising range of artists, particularly in metal, ambient, and experimental genres. Bands like The Axis of Perdition, Karak Angren, and Leviathan have referenced The King in Yellow directly, incorporating samples of readings from Chambers' stories, recitations of Cassilda's song, or song titles that reference Carcosa. These musical invocations often focus not on narrative coherence, but on mood, dissonance, dread, and lyrical decay. In dark ambient circles, albums like Nox Arcana's Theater of Illusion or Cryo Chambers' Cthulhu, Mythos compilations incorporate audio motifs designed to simulate exposure to a forbidden text, whispers, reversed speech, degraded samples. The listener becomes the reader, becomes the witness. Music in this context operates like the play itself, a medium that enters the body before the mind can resist. We must recognize that the yellow sign's migration into these media is not accidental, it is structural. The sign, as Chambers conceived it, was never static. It was always viral, always intertextual, always semiotically unstable. Its transformation into playable, audible, or visual forms simply reveals what was already there. The symbol does not need to retain its original shape. It survives as function. If it disorients, implicates, or consumes, it is the yellow sign, regardless of whether it appears as a glyph, a melody, or a line of code. But this proliferation also raises a question. Does exposure diminish its power? When the yellow sign appears on t-shirts, in Reddit IARGs, or as unlockable game content, does it become domesticated? Does repetition render it kitsch? There is no simple answer. Like all symbols, the yellow sign risks trivialization through overuse, but its very design resists this fate. Unlike the Elder Sign or the Sigil of Cthulhu, the yellow sign is protean. It changes shape, context, and meaning with each invocation. It does not settle into familiarity, it mutates. Its horror lies in its capacity to adapt, to resurface in new grammars, and this is perhaps its final triumph. It is not merely a symbol within horror, it is a symbol of horror's endurance. In our next section, we will move from media to subculture and academia, examining how the yellow sign has been appropriated not just by artists and game designers, but by communities of meaning. How has it entered the lexicon of conspiracy, the discourse of philosophy, and the imagination of those who treat it as something more than fiction? And what does that say about our collective need for symbols that unravel us? Symbols only endure when they escape their original context, and the yellow sign, more than most, has proven itself dangerously portable. What began as a literary construct in Chambers' 1895 The King in Yellow has since been appropriated by subcultures, interpreted by academics, and even incorporated into occult practice. It is no longer confined to fiction, no longer the exclusive domain of horror aficionados. Instead, it has become a floating signifier, a blank but loaded glyph onto which individuals and communities project desire, paranoia, identity, or metaphysical inquiry. This section traces how the yellow sign has been embraced, reimagined, and ritualized by subcultures that treat it not just as a symbol of narrative horror, but as a cipher of meaning in a fragmented world. Consider carefully. The yellow sign is not worshipped, but used. Its function is not belief, but destabilization. Among fringe occult groups and chaos magicians, especially those active in online communities since the early 2000s, the yellow sign has quietly become a semi-serious magical sigil. Shared in forums like occult subreddit threads, Discord servers, and fringe corners of Tumblr, the sign is often deployed as a symbol of information collapse or lucid dreaming triggers. Some practitioners claim it can be used in ritual to access false realities or trigger a state of intentional derealization, an experience where the boundaries between perception and fiction dissolve. While many use it tongue-in-cheek, others approach it with cautious reverence. Rituals involving the sign often draw from Gnostic or postmodern frameworks, invoking the king in yellow not as a deity, but as a mask, a filter, a reconfigurator of the self. Here, we see the symbol functioning as practice, not as fantasy, but as interface. The myth becomes a method. This should not be surprising. Occultism has long been intertwined with literary invention. Aleister Crowley created his own mythos. Kenneth Grant expanded Lovecraftian fiction into esoteric cosmology. Chaos magic thrives on invented gods, treating belief itself as the true tool of power. The yellow sign, ambiguous and unstable, fits perfectly within this model. Its lack of fixed meaning allows it to be activated through performance and intention. For the chaos magician, it becomes a tool for symbolic disruption, invoking not demons, but ontological ambiguity. It represents the breakdown of narrative continuity, the embrace of contradiction, the dissolution of self in the face of recursive realities. Not coincidentally, these are precisely the functions the sign performed in Chambers' original. Stories. The fiction, it seems, has completed a full ritual circle, from aesthetic to metaphor to praxis. In academic circles, the yellow sign has fared no less provocatively. Literary scholars have examined it through the lenses of post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, and trauma theory. The symbol's refusal to be defined makes it a potent metaphor for the limits of language itself, what Derrida would call difference, the endless deferral of meaning. In this reading, the yellow sign becomes a self-consuming signifier. It refers only to its own instability, generating interpretation only to annihilate it. Postmodern scholars, particularly in the wake of Jean Baudrillard, have likened the sign to the hyperreal, a simulation that replaces reality with a copy that bears no original. To engage with the sign is to enter a loop of references, a void of meaning disguised as significance. This interpretation mirrors what literary theorist Brian McHale calls ontological dominant fiction, work structured not around what happens, but around what is real. The yellow sign, under this lens, does not symbolize a thing. It symbolizes the failure of symbolization itself. Others approach the sign psychoanalytically, reading it as a trigger for the uncanny, Freud's unheimlich, that which is simultaneously familiar and alien. In this framework, the sign represents the traumatic return of repressed knowledge, the recognition that the comforting structures of narrative, language, and social identity are built on foundational incoherence. To see the sign is not to go mad in the theatrical sense, but to experience a psychic short circuit, the return of that which cannot be assimilated. Lacanian critics have positioned it at the boundary between the symbolic and the real, a mark that destabilizes the subject by revealing the artificiality of the symbolic order itself. It is not madness, it is structural recognition. The psyche, upon seeing the sign, glimpses its own constructedness, and in that moment, shatters. Outside of academia and esoterica, the yellow sign has been quietly adopted by various online subcultures as a badge of ironic or conspiratorial identity. It has appeared in vaporwave aesthetics, ARGs, and conspiracy-themed YouTube channels. Often these references are joking, meta, self-aware, but not without resonance. In an age of simulacra and fake news, the idea of a symbol that corrupts by exposure has uncanny appeal. Some online communities refer to reading the second act as shorthand for awakening to hidden truths, or entering into cognitive dissonance after encountering too much contradictory information. The yellow sign becomes a metaphor for red pilling, albeit in an abstract, aestheticized form. It is not about politics. It is about the moment when reality tilts and can't be righted. It is, in this context, the mark of the initiated, the anxious, the paranoid, those who feel they've seen too much and can't forget, yet what they know. The symbol, in other words, has become relatable. But this shift from literature to lifestyle poses unsettling questions. What happens when a symbol of epistemic collapse becomes part of identity formation? When people want to be marked by the yellow sign, to wear it on a patch or tattoo it onto their skin, does this defang the horror, or does it deepen it? Perhaps the sign was always destined to become a badge, not of allegiance, but of complicity. A way of saying, I too understand that things do not make sense. The symbol becomes a shared signal of incoherence, a social nod toward the ungraspable. It is not belief in the sign that matters, but what it represents about belief itself. We must recognize finally that these appropriations, occult, academic, and subcultural, do not dilute the yellow sign. They extend its function. Chambers' creation was always less about story and more about contagion, less about myth and more about the machinery of myth-making. That the sign is now used in rituals, lectures, or memes only confirms its vitality. It was never meant to stay in one form. It was meant to mutate, to travel, to mark. It is not simply that people have used the yellow sign. It is that the sign has used them. In our concluding section, we will follow this implication to its final threshold. What are the psychological and philosophical consequences of a world in which fiction can contaminate perception? If symbols like the yellow sign continue to replicate, what does that suggest? Not about horror, but about us. The yellow sign endures not merely as a symbol within a narrative, but as a symbol that escapes narrative. It lingers, not because it is seen, but because it is remembered. More than a literary motif, it has become a philosophical irritant, a conceptual splinter lodged in the mind of culture, fiction, and theory alike. In this final section, we examine the psychological and philosophical implications of the yellow sign's survival across centuries and mediums. Why does it persist? What human need or fear does it speak to? And what happens to the individual, and perhaps to culture itself, when such a symbol continues to replicate through language, image, and belief? We will not attempt to answer these questions fully. In the spirit of Chambers' original work, we will leave their implications suggestive, not conclusive. Some knowledge, as we have learned, resists resolution. At its core, the yellow sign reveals a terrifying truth. That perception is not a mirror of reality, but a filter imposed upon it. This is not a new insight. Philosophers from Plato to Kant to Husserl have warned that the world as we know it is mediated, shaped by form, concept, and cognition. But where these thinkers saw perception as a pathway to truth, however indirect, the yellow sign reverses that hope. It suggests that to see truly is not to ascend toward understanding, but to descend into irreconcilable contradiction. The sign becomes a metaphor for the moment when our perceptual frameworks collapse and we glimpse the raw, uninterpretable flux beneath. And what we glimpse is not meaning, but its absence. This is not nihilism, but epistemic nihilism. The condition of suspecting that no interpretation, no story, no structure can ever fully explain the world. Once seen, the sign does not answer. It erases the question. From a psychological perspective, this encounter reflects the experience of derealization, a dissociative state in which the world appears unreal, dreamlike, or flat. Many who suffer derealization describe it in language chillingly similar to that used in The King in Yellow, a sense that time is fragile, that faces become masks, that familiar places seem subtly rearranged. The mind, no longer trusting its own senses, retreats into recursive doubt. In Chambers' fiction, this is not a temporary condition. It is the final stage of awareness. The yellow sign does not cause madness in the theatrical sense. It causes clarity, a terrible clarity that the world, as structured by mind and language, is a hallucination curated for survival. This resonates with modern cognitive science, which increasingly suggests that perception is not passive reception, but predictive modeling. The brain guesses what it sees and then confirms it. The yellow sign, in this light, is the breakdown of the guess. We must pause here to reflect on why such an idea would comfort as well as terrify. The yellow sign offers no escape, no salvation, no moral arc, and yet it persists, even attracts. Perhaps this is because it names a suspicion we already carry, that the stories we are told about history, identity, science, divinity are fiction stitched together to ward off collapse. The sign is what emerges when those stitches come loose. In this way, it does not merely represent horror, it represents truth as horror. And for some, this is not repellent, but oddly relieving. To name the void is to acknowledge it. To mark it with a symbol is to say, I see it too. This is why the yellow sign becomes not just a motif of collapse, but a badge of complicity. Not because one believes in it, but because one recognizes what it symbolizes, the unbearable weight of unfiltered reality. This insight is mirrored in post-structuralist theory, particularly in the works of Derrida, Foucault, and Baudrillard. These thinkers challenge the idea that meaning is ever stable, that truth can be uncovered, that language is transparent, that power is visible. In their view, systems of knowledge are haunted by what they exclude. The yellow sign becomes, in this framework, the ghost of the repressed, a symbol not of content, but of failure to contain. It is what returns when systems break, when language folds in on itself, when the facade of structure reveals the chaos beneath. It is not the other. It is the mirror of the self, fragmented, recursive, and stripped of narrative comfort. And yet, the sign is not only theoretical. In an age defined by information saturation, algorithmic opacity, and reality-distorting media, it has become increasingly difficult to distinguish signal from noise, truth from simulation. The yellow sign has become, whether knowingly or not, a symbol of life under informational collapse. Like QAnon's cryptic prophecies, like viral TikTok hoaxes that cross into belief, like conspiracy memes that spark real-world violence, the sign represents the way symbols now function as vectors, not vessels. They carry not knowledge, but effect, fear, awe, suspicion. To see the yellow sign is not to learn something, it is to become unstable. It is to wonder whether every piece of information you have absorbed might be another fragment of the second act. But perhaps we must go further still. Perhaps the enduring presence of the yellow sign indicates something intrinsic about the human condition, a need for symbolic annihilation. In a culture that prizes clarity, productivity, and structure, the sign becomes an anti-symbol, an outlet for what cannot be named. Like the Tarot's Tower or the Black Obelisk in 2001, a space odyssey, the yellow sign speaks not to what is, but to what cannot be resolved. It allows us briefly to rest in uncertainty. It does not demand belief, only recognition. And in that recognition, we find not answers, but affinity. We join a lineage, not of cultists or mystics, but of those who have glimpsed the recursive machinery of knowledge itself and whispered, "This too shall unmake us." We must recognize, then, that the yellow sign has become more than a symbol. It is now a cultural function, a recursive device embedded in story, psyche, and language. Its continued appearance across time, media, and subculture suggests that we are not done with it, and it is not done with us. Its meaning cannot be finalized because finalization is precisely what it disrupts. To speak of it is to participate in its unfolding. To define it is to misrecognize it. To forget it is perhaps impossible. And so, we end where we began, in the shadow of a glyph that promises nothing and takes everything. Not because it is evil, but because it is. It stands as a reminder that fiction can mutate, that perception can betray, that knowledge is not neutral, and in that reminder, it marks us. Perhaps that is why it is called a sign, not of what is to come, but of what always was, and what now cannot be unseen.